Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you here. So I'm going to just jump straight into things. Well, actually, first I'll give you a little bit of an intro. My name's Nick. I've worked as a narrative designer for about 9 years now. I have also worked in academia, which is where I am getting a lot of my information for this particular talk. If you attended my earlier talk today, I was dealing primarily with anthropology in relation to world building. We'll be touching on that a little bit again in this talk. But just a quick disclaimer, I am not an anthropologist, I am not a historian, I am an armchair anthropologist and historian at best. So this is just my thoughts, I guess, rather than anything that you should necessarily take as 100% fact. So let's begin. So, often when we are talking about games, we tend to think of them as being like relatively modern inventions, interactive narratives, choose your own adventure, that sort of stuff. It's all within the last, 50 years or so that we tend to think of. But in actuality, games have a long tradition, and in particular, interactive stories. While the technology that we use to create our interactive stories today are obviously very modern, I think a case can be made that this sort of form of storytelling is actually drawing from like quite an ancient tradition. So today I'm going to try and chart an evolutionary pathway for you guys from primitive times all the way to the present day. We're going to see how this tradition has developed over thousands of years and learn how if we can reunite with this idea, then we'll get a better understanding of what we're doing and what players are actually after with our games, and how we can sort of imbue our games with cultural resonance. So I'm going to begin with early oral storytelling. So when we think about the earliest forms of stories, we often think about sort of people sitting around the campfire and sort of sharing little folk tales and things like that, right? In the research that I have done, this often took the form of basically an elder of a village or a tribe leading the storytelling. Sometimes it was a shaman, sometimes some other religious figure. And these sorts of stories that were told around the campfire, they were told for a specific purpose, right? Back then, the world was big, it was scary, there were predators everywhere, and people were in small communities, right? So stories at this point in history were primarily about instruction. So they were a way to prepare the warriors or the hunters of a tribe to sort of go out and bring back resources for the rest of their community. The other interesting thing about these sorts of stories is that they were interactive, right? They operate in what we sort of call a call and response sort of structure or process. So basically you would have your shaman, your storyteller telling a story, but you'd also have hunters and warriors that had already been out into the wilderness, right? And they were coming back with new information. And so the storyteller during these sorts of campfire experiences would allow for people to call respond to the story with new details, and the storyteller would incorporate those details into the mix, right? So there was this sort of conversational interaction happening between the storyteller and the audience. So the purpose of this was building up this sort of knowledge base on how to survive. Now we're going to jump forward quite a few, probably hundreds, if not thousands of years into the future, and we get what I'd like to call modular narrative building blocks. So as storytelling developed, there was also sort of this shorthand that was developed alongside it, and this shorthand made it easier for the audience to collaborate with the storyteller or become storytellers themselves. So these building blocks were comprised mainly of motifs and archetypes, so symbols and character types, images, these sorts of things, themes, things like the reoccurring characters that we see today even in modern films and games, right? Like the hero or the trickster or the wise mentor or the monster. So we can kind of think about these building blocks as like Lego bricks. They're designed in a way that they're able to be combined and recombined in different orders to create myths, legends, folk stories that both feel familiar to the audience as well as new and original. And they also worked regardless of time or place. And these remain, as I said, still popular today, right? The psychiatrist Carl Jung, he sort of theorized about motifs and archetypes a lot in his work, and he sort of suggested that the reason why these had such resonance to them was because they were entrenched in human psyche. He called this idea, or this sort of shared reservoir of ideas, the collective unconscious. Then, moving forward again, once we get to sort of the Renaissance sort of era, a little bit earlier for some other examples as well, we get what often gets called divination engines, right? And these, I believe, are kind of like proto-interactive narratives. So they are obviously originally designed for telling the future. But when we strip them of this sort of supernatural power, what we see is that they are essentially random storytelling generators. They make use of chance, they make use of interactivity and audience interpretation to construct a narrative. One example we can look at is tarot. So this began as a card game in Italy called Trionfe, and it was just basically a simple card game, kind of similar to like games like poker. But at a certain point, an artist was commissioned to design the artwork for the cards, and he made use of a lot of deeply symbolic, motif-heavy imagery on the cards that he designed. And these became what I believe is called the Rider-Waite deck, which is what we sort of all associate with tarot today. And they allowed people to tell the future, or maybe more accurately understand their own subconscious. So they were a way to make sense of things through randomness, through archetypes, motifs, and player interpretation. A second example I've got here is the I-Ching. So the I-Ching, I believe, comes from China originally, and it made use of casting sticks or coins, and this would sort of come up with a random set of numbers, and then the person who threw the sticks would consult a book of poetry for the verse that corresponded with the number that they had rolled, and then they would derive personal meaning from that. So once again, we're seeing randomness, we're seeing interactivity, and we're seeing narrative being constructed from the results. The other thing I'll say here is both of these use the modular narrative building blocks as well, and are sort of consciously or subconsciously being converted into sort of meaningful wholes. So I'm going to give you a little example here of tarot specifically, and how tarot can be used to tell a story. I've sort of mentioned that typically it's a way to sort of understand your own subconscious, but it can be adapted for the stories that we associate more with video games, right? Like genre fiction. So I have done a random spread here. You'll just have to trust me on that. So we've got first the Five of Pentacles. And the Five of Pentacles, depending on who you talk to, can represent different things. But in my sort of research, I found that it tends to represent lack, loss, insecurity, or sort of struggling alone. Our next card is the Devil. Dangerous. This often represents toxic habits, fear, unhealthy attachments, or being held back by something. When we get to our third card, we've got Temperance. So this represents balance, patience, moderation, harmony. And then we have, what is that? The Knight of Swords, which can represent decisive action, determination, clear, direct steps forward. And then our last card here we have is the World. And this can represent completion, breakthrough, wholeness, and closure. So you can kind of see how these cards can be used to like sort of understand personal issues in your life, right? You can kind of look at them and go, well, what do I feel like I'm lacking? What do I feel are toxic habits around me? That sort of thing. But like I said, we can also use this for fiction. So for example here, I've written a little story outline for you guys based off these cards. So let's say we're dealing with like a gothic horror story, right? So with our first card, we could say that a recently widowed scholar inherits a ruined estate, and the villagers around the estate whisper that it's cursed. So we are seeing lack and loss and insecurity in the widowed scholar, and we are seeing the struggling alone by them coming to the estate and having to deal with it themselves. Then if we move to the next card, the Devil, we can say that the family that used to live at the estate bound themselves to a demon. They made some sort of pact for wealth or power or whatever, and now that dark pact stains the land, right? If we move to the next one, we can then say like the scholar, while they are taking care of this estate, they are experiencing hauntings, strange events, weird things going on, and they have to work with a superstitious caretaker to solve the mystery, right? For the next card, we can say that the scholar and caretaker eventually hunt down the demon's sigil to the estate library or somewhere like that. Maybe it's a dungeon. And they burn that sigil to break the curse. And then with our final card, we can now say that the estate has been cleansed of evil, the scholar's family name has been restored, and perhaps they even find internal peace, and perhaps they even fall in love with the caretaker or something like that, right? So we can kind of see here how you can take the symbolic interpretations of these cards and turn them into a nice little piece of fiction. So we are still kind of far away from what we understand as modern interactive storytelling, right? So we're kind of looking for that missing link. And I think personally for me, that missing link is tabletop role-playing games, right? So let's skip ahead here, skip. Sorry, if anyone wants my slides, feel free to ask me afterwards. Right, here we go. So these are similar to tabletop role-playing games and other sort of collective storytelling games. They can kind of be seen as this missing link. They blend communal performative play with archetypes, with motifs, and structured mechanics that increase sort of the complexity of the experience. And I believe they pave the way for what we know today as narrative-based video games. So if we jump to these, we can see that they are, well, hopefully we can see a connection through all of these different types of games to the modern day. We can see this in nonlinear branching. This is comparable to sort of the back and forth of communal tribal storytelling. Modular quest design, we can see that in the sort of folkloric archetypes and motifs that are recycled in mythology and the divination engines that I mentioned earlier. And then procedural storytelling, we can compare that to random generation of story elements and divination engines, as well as in tabletop role-playing games. So all of these are kind of different mediums of telling a story, but they all sort of share the same human impulse, right, which is participatory story play. So why does this all matter? Interactive narratives, they're not new. They are a continuation of ancient roots. Video games are kind of like modern ritual spaces, like what we were talking about with the campfire. They're a place where story can be shared, improvised, lived, and lessons can be learned from them. It is also an ancient human desire. So understanding these roots helps us design experiences that feel natural and intuitive to the player. And then players don't just want choices, I think is another revelation that I had when I was studying this. They want to feel like co-authors in our stories. So if we can see games as like part of this timeless tradition, it frees us up to engage with players in collaborative, deeply human ways. And lastly, games can have cultural weight to them. They are cultural artifacts, they are descendant from cultural artifacts, and they really should be celebrated and preserved for that, if only that. So yeah, that is my little talk on that, but I think we probably have some time for some questions if anyone has any. Thank you. Thank you very much.